open education at Northwest University, South Africa. He is professor in the School of Professional Studies in Education at Northwest University. He obtained his PhD in 2011 from Northwest University, South Africa. He has numerous publications to his credit and presented many papers at several national and international conferences and seminars. He is an active member of a number of educational and language-related professional and academic societies. He is recipient of Education Association of South Africa Emerging Researcher Medal in 2018. He is also an active member of the Creative Commons chapter of South Africa, and he is also leading the network of open educational resources and multimodal self-directed learning in Southern Africa. His research areas are multimodal learning, open educational resources, blended learning, multi-literacies, pedagogies, e-learning in language classrooms, screen translation, and socio-linguistics. Today, Professor Jaco Olivier is deliberating on the topic, self-directed learning through renewable assessments, students as producers in open education. So not coming in between you and the learned speaker, I request Professor Olivier to deliberate on the topic. Sir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Monica Bajaj, for the introduction. Dear conference organizers and attendees, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you, Dr. Adit Gupta, for the invitation as well. It's very kind of you to include me in this proceedings. And it's a privilege to share a view from South Africa for this conference on perspectives in teaching, learning, and assessment during the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know if anyone can maybe just confirm whether you can see my screen in the chat, perhaps.
Yeah, confirm. We can see it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I want to link up with what the previous speaker shared, and I will also reflect on assessment specifically. And I think for all of us, this is really a big and a contentious issue, and something that is problematic during COVID, but even post-COVID. What will we do? Will we actually go back to the old normal? And my hope is that we don't do that, and that we learn from this context and improve our teaching and learning practices and assessment practices specifically. I'm going to cover quite a lot, and I will try and only highlight certain aspects of a study that we did last year. And this is part of a bigger project that we're doing in terms of renewable assessments. And you might be aware of the concept in North America. It's usually referred to as renewable assignments, but we do prefer the word assessments within our context. So I need to say something about the context where we're in. You can see there's two of the main buildings of our two campuses in the Northwest province. I'm at the bottom there with my mask on. We are still also mandated to wear masks in buildings in South Africa. But to the context a bit more, Republic of South Africa, on the southern tip of Africa, we are situated in the Northwest and in the Gauteng province. Our university is both contact and a distance university. So we traditionally, and especially pre-COVID, we had about 40,000 students who attended classes in person, in contact, and just under 20,000 who attended classes remotely by distance mode, and some of them attending it using remote centers. We've got about 70 centers across the country, and even in some neighboring countries, especially in rural areas where the students will not have access to the internet. And we saw that as a big problem during the COVID, especially where access to technology and especially access to the internet was quite a big challenge. So the research we did was mainly based on the Potchefstroom and Van der Bijlpark campus, although I myself It's located on the Mahikeng campus. You can see on the map there, just on the border of the country of Botswana. So we're about the third largest university in South Africa. And as I say, we used to have this dual mode. These days, of course, all our students, or during COVID, all our students were distance students. You know, they had to access learning through distance. But currently, we are back with a hybrid approach again. So the majority of our students are back on campus, although they can't attend classes as like they used to because of some legislation in terms of COVID that is still in force. So this study I want to share with you about today pertain to a specific two sets of groups of student teachers. So I'm in a faculty of education, so we are involved in training teachers, but this approach could be used in any other faculty as well. So it lends itself very nicely to the training of teachers, because we want them to be responsible in the way that they create resources and so on. So the question that guided this research and this presentation was that how can self-directed learning be fostered through renewable assessments for under-resourced languages where students act as producers in open education with a blended learning environment. The blended, in this case, is a bit strangely defined, because at the time when we did this, the face-to-face contact was very limited. So the blend came in the fact that we both included traditional contact and distance students, but we can leave it there. That is not as important for the rest of the discussion. South Africa, of course, similar to India and similar to many other countries in the world, is very multilingual. We also have 11 official languages that are recognized by our constitution. However, education tends to be mainly in English in South Africa, at school and university level. I'm going to talk only in terms of university context today, and I'm only going to talk about some specific modules as I indicated. But I want to highlight the term self-directed learning. And if you go away from this keynote today and you remember only one thing, then I hope it will be self-directed learning. It's an old concept. It's associated a lot with andragogy, so the teaching of training of adults. However, we've found at Northwest that self-directed learning is important for all levels of education. At school, even preschool, at all levels, that is highly relevant. I will share one link with you, and this is something that if you want to know a bit more, apologies to the colleagues in the auditorium who might not be able to copy that one, but you're welcome to contact me and I can share it with you. That's our book series on self-directed learning. There's some of the books here behind me, like this one. And on that website that I've shared, they're all available for free as open access. So if you want to get to know self-directed learning, that's a place to start. But for our discussion, what is self-directed learning? It is a process in which individuals take the initiative with or without the help of others. So very important, this is not autonomous, alone learning. This could be with others. In diagnosing their learning needs, formulating learning goals, identifying human and material resources, and that's important for our discussion today, is the resources for learning, choosing and implementing appropriate learning strategies, and evaluating those learning outcomes. So this is Knowles' idea of self-directed learning, and we build on this definition quite a lot. Yes, it's old, but it is as relevant today as it was in the 70s. Why? In South Africa, we have a situation where our schooling is very teacher-centered, often, not always, often, and even at university level, that is what students are used to, and that's what they prefer. Although we want to urge and we are advocating for a learner-centered education and an active learning approach, where you can bring in collaboration and cooperative learning and problem-based learning and others. So for me, when I look at learning, this is my starting point, is including self-directed learning as an approach. As I said, more student-focused, and we recognize the roles of the students, and collaboration and real-life authentic solutions or challenges even could be quite useful. In terms of learning theory, I want to highlight this term, also not necessarily that well known. We know constructivism and we know social constructivism, but communal constructivism underpins renewable assessments. Why? Because this approach emphasizes the communal. In the African context, we talk about Ubuntu, the idea of I am not just myself in myself, but only through others. So that communal idea of learning is quite important. What progresses this learning theory from social constructivism to communal constructivism is specifically the contribution to the community. So you can see there at the quote at the bottom that we want learners, students, to be actively engaged in the process of constructing knowledge for their learning community and even the wider community. You can see also that Holmes and Gardner emphasized there that communal knowledge base for the benefit of their community's existing and new learners is the aim when they work with communal constructivism. So I think it's highly relevant, and it brings in not just the social, but also the community responsibility into the mix. Now, I'm also talking about open education today, and I think COVID made it relevant for us to consider how we get access to resources. And in South Africa, we have the unfortunate situation that quite often in higher education, textbooks must be bought, they're commercial, they're very expensive. And what happens in the end is that students copy them illegally. Our copyright law does not allow you to just copy for educational purposes, or they would just go without and maybe buy notes and study from that. And that is not the ideal. So I want to talk a little bit about open education as well as our approach. Now, Paquette came up with the idea of open pedagogy, or pédagogique ouverte. And the foundational values in Paquette's work was that open education should support autonomy and interdependence. And interdependence is also very important for self-directed learning, freedom and responsibility, and putting that, both the freedom and the responsibility, in the hands of the students. And very important, and this is again the communal aspect, democracy and participation. I did research a couple of years ago with our own students and staff, and it was evident from the research, and that was focused on culturally appropriate learning and whether the student voices are heard in the selection of content. And the overarching view and the majority view was no, students have not got a say in contributing to resources used for learning, and they don't have a say in picking the topics. This is determined by the lecturer, and quite even determined by the department or some outside force, not the students. So with open education, we need to bring that issue back into the mix. So if I talk about open educational resources within this open context, I do link this specifically with the UNESCO definition. And here, open educational resources are learning, teaching, research materials in any format or medium. But very importantly, you can see there that it is released on an open license, and it can be accessed, reused, repurposed, adapted, and redistributed by anyone. For me, the greatest advantage of open educational resources, of course, is the fact that we can contextualize it. So we're not using an American textbook with content that is foreign to our students. And we can also localize it, and that brings in the language aspect. And I will talk a little bit about language also today. In South Africa, as I said, multilingual country, language is quite a big challenge sometimes, although I think we should rather build on it being a resource for teaching and learning purposes. So open pedagogy, it's the learning and teaching that we associate with the use of open educational resources. And if you look at Cronin's definition there, it relates to collaborative practices that include the creation and use and reuse of OERs. So quite often, and I'm involved with the Open Education for a Better World program, which I can highly recommend to any of you considering to create an open educational resource. The idea is generally we create as lecturers, as academics, we create OERs, and they are used in our classes. And I do want to advocate for making use of students in that process. So the student voice is very important for me. And we had a number of examples at Northwest University where students actually react very positively to this. And just as a side note, within the South African context, this is even more relevant as there's a push from students for a decolonized curriculum. And that can only be reached if the student voices are included, not merely the lecturers, not merely content that we get from the global north or from the west. So open pedagogy relates to using OERs, but also adapting them and also creating it afresh. But more importantly, empowering students to adapt and create the OERs themselves. And this brings in the issue of disposable and renewable assignments or assessments. And an element of advocacy, because our students can become the advocates for open education. So my question to you this morning is, how many people will read your students' assessments? And quite often it'll be the student, hopefully, and you as the lecturer marking the assessment. And that prompts the question, will these assessments ever be used again? Or is the idea that they will end up in the dustbin? And that brings me to the concept of disposable assignments, renewable assignments, and that's the terms used by David Wiley and colleagues who've written on this. As I say, in South Africa, we prefer the term renewable assessment, but just to give you a sense what these two concepts mean. So a disposable assignment is any assignment about which students and faculty, the teachers, understand the following: the students will do the work, the faculty will grade the work, and the students will throw away the work. So it's gone. So all that work for one, hopefully good read by the lecturer, you get your mark, and that's finished. David Wiley says that about 40 million hours a year are spent on this. And you can think now, how many hours do we waste where we could have created resources that could have been used by someone else for the benefit of learning or whatever the case might be. And you can think how that can be implemented in different disciplines. So we are aiming to have renewable assignments or renewable assessments where students will do the work, faculty will grade, and then, very importantly, the work is inherently valuable to someone beyond the class. And the work is open and published so that other people can find and use it within the 5R framework. So Wiley and John Hilton define renewable assignments as assignments which both support individuals' learning, but result in new and improved OERs that provide lasting benefit. So we want to move away from assignments just being read by the lecturer, and because they can have purpose. Yes, and I can hear you say, but what about the quality? And what do they know? Actually, our students quite often know a lot. And that assignment can actually become the learning. The previous talk was quite significant on assessments, and I think we don't talk enough about this assessment and assignments and how assessments can actually not just be of the learning, but the assessments can be for the learning, and assessments can be as the learning. And that is important also with renewable assessments, because the creation of the OER is the learning process. It's not merely testing what they know. You can see there, David Wiley and John Hilton has distinguished between disposable, authentic, constructionist, and renewable assignments, but I'm not going to go into those details. It's just depending on the level of reuse and the level of contribution outside, they distinguish between them. So for renewable assessments, we want something that is contextualized. Very important. It makes pedagogical sense, but it also makes sense in terms of, as I said, decolonization of the curriculum, linking up with the student's own world. And it's a very powerful concept. I mean, if I look at textbooks that are often used, even at our schools level, even is something as simple as a house. A house in the global north does not look like a typical house in South Africa. And the local should be very, very local. Even here in Mahikeng, where I'm sitting, it'll be different from a city like Johannesburg or Durban or Cape Town. So Wiley highlights that such assignments should provide a learning benefit to the student and the broader community, and that's what we wanted. I've got some examples if you want to get a sense of what can be done as renewable assessments. This comes from Bob Casper. He's a librarian, and he shared this on a blog that it could be Wikipedia articles, and towards the end there, something like an open education reader, or very often it's something like an open textbook. So getting students to write a textbook, and we had an example recently at Northwest where we involved students in the creation of an open textbook that can be used. So building on Katzen van Allen's renewable design framework, moving from analyzing, classifying, considering the OER contributions that are there already, selecting the tools and repositories, ideally open source tools. We then move to designing and intentional negotiations for openness, and finally reclassifying and finalizing the assignment. But there are some issues. So how do we ensure the quality? And I would suggest there that we build in peer review processes, and I'll refer back to that at the end. And we can also consider how many times can you recycle this. So you can't do this forever. You might need to reinvent the assessment after a couple of years. And open publication or not, that is also a question. And especially if your institution's intellectual property policy doesn't allow students to just publish content like this openly. And sometimes students prefer not to. But just again, as a side note, there my recommendation would be that you always get the consent of students before sharing their content online, especially if it's like a video recording or something like that. And who owns it? That'll depend on your intellectual property policy. But ultimately, this is part of empowering students, in our case, student teachers, to have sharing practices in mind. And then, of course, plagiarism also comes in as and that is something that you have to engage with students, and that they understand what reuse of openly licensed material would be versus plagiarism, which is illegally using copyrighted material. So OERs are quite prominent worldwide, and I think for our purposes, we wanted to build some capacity within the institution and also expand on OERs. As I mentioned before, we've got 11 official languages, and there's been increased support for African languages specifically, languages other than English and Afrikaans, which are both languages with European roots, and there's a clear hegemony of English. As I said, this is part of a bigger project, exploring self-directed language learning on the one hand, but also renewable assessments on the other hand. So we had an intervention where student teachers created open education resources and selected under-resourced languages. Through this process, they were empowered to create, adapt, and localize resources, but mainly create, and then share them ethically and responsibly. So these OERs would become renewable assessments as they could be reused by subsequent classes, and that could even prompt further assignments. So from this qualitative research, I'm going to share some of the findings and some of the views of our students. As you can see there, it's not very big class groups. They were speakers of isiZulu, which is one of the biggest languages in South Africa, and also Sesotho sa Leboa, also known as Northern Sotho. So that's the two language groups and the two classes that we included in this research. So they had to be studying African language models. So the students involved in this research will one day become language teachers. So that was our group. And we intentionally selected them because they have or tend to have a greater sense of language awareness. And we encourage them to create resources, not only language related resources, but also resources in other subjects. And that, I think, could also be something useful. And that resources, the intention would be to be reused with students, but also to be shared online so that other teachers can use them. So open invitation, and we also, from that group, 83 of them responded to our open-ended questionnaire. And you can see there the mother tongue of them are spread between isiZulu, English, and Sesotho sa Leboa. Through our inductive qualitative analysis, we found some findings, and we tried to ensure the trustworthiness of the independent coding. So at this point, I do want to acknowledge the contribution made by Dr. Matome Mabilecha and Dr. Emmanuel Nguenia, who were also my co-researchers in this process. We also had ethical clearance to do this research. So important for our approach to the open learning was infusing self-directed learning. And we drew a lot on Garrison's 3 dimensions of highlighting motivation, ensuring self-management, and that relates to task control and having a focus, and then also self-monitoring. So getting students to take charge of monitoring their progress, monitoring their needs. Garrison's dimensions are quite useful. As I said, this is within a blended environment, but blended only to an extent. So for the participants, even without us emphasizing it, they immediately noted that motivation, and you can see the verbatim quotations in purple by the students. So apologies if there are major language issues. That is as they provided it in their feedback. Some of these were translated. I must just also add that. So all of them are in English, but some of the students did answer in either isiZulu or Sotho. In any case, so motivational aspects stood out for them. But for them, motivation was also linked with doing something that can relate to their career one day. So once again, our students are insisting that their learning is situated and authentic to what they want to become. And also, motivation for them relates to being able to enjoy the module. We underestimate the effectual quite often and focus on the outcomes and not how they feel about it. And it's also important here that for the students, it was that the positivity towards the learning situation was prompted and supported by the lecturer. So even though we aimed for a very student-centered approach, they did look up to the lecturer. Is the lecturer actually saying, yes, come on, students, do this, and would they imbue some positivity in them? But there was also some more negative aspects, that they would be motivated by a fear of failing. You can see here, the fear of repeating content of a language that I do not fully understand motivates me to avoid failing the module and just learn. And that is not what we want. But some of them, and this was some quite significant, and I would wonder whether this would be true in your context, for example. Especially for one language, the students indicated that they want to create OERs in that language because they've got an emotional connection with that language. And that's a very interesting finding for me. I didn't anticipate that at all. And there's also evidence among the participants that learning is managed and structured by them. And that was good news. So they are moving to becoming self-directed. A recurring idea and concept was time and time management. And do keep in mind, some of these students are distance students. So they are working full-time. So quite often they have to specifically time or plan time to learn, unlike a contact student where it's just one of many things that happen in a day. They are learning the whole time, as it were. Then they also showed some evidence of being able to select relevant learning strategies. They also had a sense of perceived success and understanding of content and instructions. Interestingly, the management of their learning they reflected would sometimes be only prompted externally. So it's not just them, it's the lecturer reminding them, emails being sent, and that is also, again, contrary to what we would expect with self-directed learning. Some reflective practices were there, and we didn't even prompt that. That came from themselves, and that's wonderful. The data also shows that some self-evaluative practices could be aligned with students acting as initiators in the context of e-learning ecologies. Wonderful book by Cope and Calancis, where they uncover this whole or explain this whole idea of e-learning ecologies. Another form of monitoring that we saw would be feedback, and I think feedback with assessment always very important, and I cannot emphasize it more. But from the students came a number of recommendations, and these we can take into future renewable assessment projects, that they want active learning. And I mentioned it at the start, we associate active learning with self-directed learning. So not being passive and listening to the lecturer, but taking part, creating. Increased collaboration. And yes, even with distance students, that is quite a challenge, especially in the South African context, where our typical distance student will be able to connect not synchronously, but asynchronously. And there we have to be very creative and use tools like Google Docs or some space where students can work together, but they don't need to be online at the same time. Students prefer having opportunities for self-evaluation. I think we need to prompt that specifically, not just leave it up to them. Clear indications of the scope of assessments. Students need to know, and they want to know, what am I doing and why am I doing this? And then also continuous communication. It goes without saying, but quite often we don't do that sufficiently. In other instances, I think communication is too much. You know, the students might get announcements from different lecturers at the same time, and so the communication should be focused. I think there needs to be a balance. And then very important, students prefer having recorded content. And I'm not a fan of recording full lessons. I don't see the sense in that. But shorter recordings, micro videos, short instructional videos are very powerful as a tool for students to revise, but also as a way through which students can create content, get them to create the short videos that can be reused. And then finally, differentiation. Our students are always at different levels of understanding, of having skills, and we need to address that. And I think in a post-COVID world, that will definitely be the next step in building more on data-driven, differentiated approaches. In the e-learning world, we talk about adaptive learning. So the learning should be adapted to the individual. And that is good news for self-directed learning. And there's a very exciting research being done in terms of learning analytics and adaptive learning. All over Northwest is working with this Swiss university on this, for example. But I think differentiation can be done fairly easily as well without building on technology. But I think technology will strengthen our hands in terms of teaching and learning there. I've proposed this framework in a recent chapter that when we want to use or work towards student-centered open pedagogy, like we've done with these language teachers or language standard student teachers, we start with an analysis of the curriculum content ourselves and then prepare the students. Don't underestimate the importance of building capacity among students to be able to create, to be able to use the tools. Say you're doing an open textbook or you're letting them create videos. You have to empower them to use the relevant software, and quite often that puts a burden on lecturers. Or you must be able to let them engage with senior students who could help. But in any case, so students need to be prepared in terms of content, but also licensing. And it's very important. As I said, we're busy with teacher training. Teachers need to know what they can share in classes, how copyright works, and also move towards a sharing culture themselves. I used to be a teacher many years ago here in South Africa and for a while in the UK, and there was very little sharing between schools. We didn't do that. And we had to reinvent the wheel every day, creating PowerPoints, creating assessments, and we don't share that. They need to understand something about instructional design if it's intended for learning. And they need to understand a lot of information literacy and meta literacy. So being able to look for content and sources. And only then can students start producing OERs by searching for existing content, because we want to reuse. Remember, one of the main aims of open education is not to reinvent the wheel. If there's a wheel already, then we use it, especially if it's openly licensed. Then also there needs to be some form of quality control. So OER evaluation, refinement, and at this point, I would build in critical peer evaluation. So students will check each other's work, maybe in groups, maybe across groups, and then external quality control. You as the lecturer, the teacher, can also play a very important role here. And this is where you can actually assess and grade the OER that's been created. Then it's shared after possible revisions, and then the process can be repeated again. And at that sharing point, that is where the communal constructivism comes in, because we are sharing something for the sake of the community. I want to almost conclude. I would recommend, and yeah, some of this might be relevant to your class, some of it might not. Many assessments can be transformed from disposable to renewable. It doesn't mean that all assessments must be like that. That is up to you. That is up to your department and rules guiding whatever module or course you are teaching. Teachers should consider different motivating factors and understand the student experiences in this regard. For student teachers, it's very important that they work as career focused, that we're not merely doing an assessment for the sake of an assessment, covering content for the sake of the contents that we think they need to know, but there must be that link, must be situated in terms of their needs. For language student teachers, and I think for any of them, the emotional link with languages actually plays in quite well. So if you are thinking of building resources in under-resourced languages, then this is a good place to start, you know, to make that link. Obviously, there's some language politics that can have an effect here, but that, again, it will depend on what you are doing and in what subject you are doing it. Students should be supported and allowed to structure and manage their own learning. We need to create opportunities for them to become self-directed. Why? We don't want students to know what they know from the university where we taught them now. We want them to become lifelong learners. UNESCO emphasizes that this aspect quite often, and I want to emphasize it. We want students to be able to teach themselves after they leave the university. And for that, they need self-directed learning skills. Time and time management is something that we also need to guide them with, and we also need to support them when they don't feel confident enough to choose their own learning strategies. But generally, if they do, we can just support that. And monitoring of learning should be scaffolded. To conclude, self-directed learning can be fostered through renewable assessments, where students act as producers in open education. We've shown that. The research has shown how Garrison's dimensions of self-directed learning, motivation, self-management, self-monitoring, are reflected in current practices, but it can still be extended. It's clear that among student teachers of these selected languages, there are many elements of self-directed learning. However, a number of measures have been identified to support further self-directed language learning. We need to not ignore the cognitive value of linguistic identity, which can also play into this if you're going down the translation route. It's also evident that multimodal learning environments, so where we've got both contact and distance, or the blended learning environments, pose specific challenges. And due to the nature of the linguistic landscape, because in many of these under-resourced languages, there are not resources you can build on, and you'll have to start with an English one and then translate. Dear colleagues, from my side, the hope is that you can reflect after today about two things. At least how you can support student agency in your learning. How can the students take charge of what they're doing? And even better, how you can change and transform your assessments to become renewable and not end up in the dustbin. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. My contact details are on the screen there. You're welcome to engage with me even after the conference. From my side, good luck with the conference, and thank you once again for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful and fruitful deliberations. And very interestingly, we have heard that term for the very first time, that is renewable assessment. So we were hearing it for longer for the resources only, but it's very interesting. Thank you so much, sir. And the key lesson from your deliberation is what I got, that to prepare students for the real life. The responsibility to learn shifts from the teacher to the student. So thank you so much, sir, for just completing your talk within the given time. And I have got several queries from the audience also. So I request you, sir, to please respond to the questions. Sir, first question is what is the ideal class size for self-directed learning?
That's a very good question, and there's no short answer. Any class size, you can do self-directed learning. Smaller is always better. We've seen a lot of success with small classes. If you've got 20, 30 students, then it works wonderfully. But we've had colleagues work with 800 students at a time for a single class, and it is possible. If you work with large classes, then you have to do it with a collaborative learning approach. So you put them in groups, and you can have them interact within that groups. And as I said, we've had some success with that. The major challenges with the big groups is ensuring that the students actually get to each other, especially with our bigger classes. There are some issues sometimes because you as the lecturer cannot control the group interaction, because that needs to happen virtually because the class is too big. Usually they would have contact classes in smaller groups, or just it might be a distance group. Then I mean there's no opportunity for them to engage in the class necessarily, so that needs to happen offline. But to your question, self-directed learning is important for any class at any size. We can bring it in, especially through technology, regardless of the class size. There was a very good article, and I'm thinking of the authors. I will see if I can quickly get hold of it, where they looked at the role of self-directed learning and MOOCs. And with MOOCs, we're talking about the thousands of people, and the colleagues there managed to accommodate self-directed learning, even though they had large groups. So yes, I don't think that the class size is as important as the what you do with them in terms of the class. Yes. Sorry, over to you again.
So second question is like, what supportive strategies could be used to enhance self-directed learning for student teachers?
Yes, there are many strategies. First of all, I would definitely advocate for active learning. So active learning in the sense of ensuring that the learning is through creation, discussion, not merely just listening to the lecturer and giving back the content in some sort of an examination. So yeah, that's where I would start, and that would be active learning steps. Colleagues, I'm just adding the link to the chat there on the MOOC article. Other strategies would be problem-based learning. So creating a real-life problem from which students can then create steps to address the problem. One famous example, this is from Professor Carl Wirth from the US. He teaches geography, and he would tell his students, there's this issue on this island somewhere, they've got a volcano there, we need to create solutions for them to handle the situation. And every week he will send them information about how that volcano is going on. And in the student's mind, this is actually happening, but it's merely a case study on his side. So authentic. So the students must always have a sense of that we are addressing an authentic problem, an authentic assessment. Other strategies, and I'll just mention them briefly, would be collaborative learning or cooperative learning. So both, and it will depend on the nature of the groups there, of course. Case-based learning can also work quite well. So there are many strategies, and I would encourage colleagues to look at the books that I listed. They're open access, so you can download it and you can share it with whoever. Many of the strategies that I've mentioned are unpacked there, and there are even more. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one another question is, like a country like India, who has set curriculum at all stages of education. What do you think? How it can go simultaneously with that setup?
I missed the last part of your question. How can it go simultaneously with what?
Sir, what do you think, like a set curriculum like we have in India? So it is, I think, self-directed learning is little bit time consuming. So how it can go simultaneously with that kind of setup?
We have a similar situation at our school level. In South Africa, our school education is clearly set out by our curriculum and assessment policy statement documents. So there's no choice really for teachers even. For me, the self-directed learning comes in the classroom day by day. So if you've got set content, that's fine. If you've got set textbooks, that's even fine. It's what you do with the learning process. So giving students the opportunity to engage with that textbook, engage with the topic that is set in a way that they can still select the strategies that they prefer, and they can still select other resources. And remember, resources, not just the textbook. A resource can be someone else. It can be a parent. It can be someone from the community. It can be another learner, another student in the class. So it's about creating a space where students, where learners are able to build on what you as a teacher have set, and keep in mind that we always start off with a teacher-centered approach, moving towards a more learner-centered approach. And also one can scaffold that across years. So the younger, the less you need to emphasize them taking charge of their own learning. The older they get, the easier and the more sensible it would be. But yes, a set curriculum, a set resource structure will not impede self-directedness. It's easier if they can select everything, and renewable assessments might also be tricky in places where the assessments are very rigidly structured, but you can always build that in. You know, most of our assessments can be transformed to have an element of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, like everywhere in the classrooms, we have different kinds of students. There can be above average students, average and below average. So how to cater the needs of moderate or below average student in the classroom with the self-directed learning?
Once again, I would definitely emphasize here that I think the needs of the students will definitely be different always, and there will always be an element of students needing more support. And I do think that with self-directed learning, we don't exclude that we can provide additional support for students that might have special needs, even that might need different needs. So an adaptive approach would be my recommendation there. Yes, I think building in aspects that can be of support would be the best, but it is difficult at school level. Electronically, it's fairly easy because you can build in adaptive learning steps, but I think in a wider sense, we as lecturers, the burden will be on us to make sure that we differentiate sufficiently. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for answering the questions, and thank you, sir, for this wonderful deliberation. Definitely, we will also try this self-directed learning in our classroom, and we will try to motivate our own student teachers to do this kind of activity in their real class. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful deliberation. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Olivier, for connecting with us today for this wonderful session. It was indeed a pleasure to listen to you, and especially the concept of renewable and the non-renewable assessment. We never thought about it this way at our end, but it's given us a lot of food for thought. And so we should be, touching base with you in future as well to deliberate on some of these issues. And hopefully we could, build these new types of, self-directed learning abilities and strategies into our classroom, both at the school as well as the college level. And if required, we'll rack your brain sometimes in the future on this particular topic. But thank you again for, accepting our invite and connecting for today's keynote address. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and all the best to you with the rest of the conference, and good luck with all the wonderful work you're doing in terms of assessments and with teaching and learning, especially in these trying times. But all the best and greetings from South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.